I finally did it. Um, the discussion. This is your opportunity to finally say what's in your mind. How do you want to interpret your data? It puts your data into perspective. How does it fit in the field? So that's where the tree of arguments helps because here it is almost a tree of argument. Um, you can propose a model of how things work, how you interpret or you think things work. You can propose new experiments at the end, and you can make your readers think and how it all means. So as soon as we finish our results, we have fresh in our mind what we did and what data we want to discuss. Or when you're writing your results, make notes of the important parts that you want to discuss. One of the participants said that, I want to discuss this model that I'm proposing. It was the most important part, but you cannot discuss a proposal model that you haven't done until you get to the discussion. So you had to present the data first and then immediately start discussing the most important to the other. So remember, in the style, we said that the introduction was general, from the general to the specific, and the discussion is the opposite, specific findings and then general implications. So you start with the main finding again, repeated, that you have found, that is new discovery that you want to highlight. And then you said, we found this. You do not repeat the results, but you said, as shown in results, this is what we found. Generalized, not using exactly the same words as you used before, but anyway. Um, and then you said, we have this main finding. Um, but it doesn't compare with others. In the literature, it's been found the opposite or the same, or is supported by or it's not supported by. But our implications are different. And then you can discuss what are the general implications or the specific implications for this. On this is where you would say, we would like, based on our findings and the fact that other people do not know about this or there's not more information, we want to propose a new model based on our discoveries that we think will greatly address this issue. And then you go to the general, because this will be helpful to establish policies that will address this need in the country or in general science. For example, one of our colleagues is studying the management of patients with autism, which is a big range. It's a very difficult um, disease to explain, to manage. It's a very difficult disease to manage. And I keep thinking as I read his data and his results, that is so needed, a nonprofit or agency that could give support to children and caretakers with or children with autism and their care healthcare workers or the caretakers and the family. And you will make a strong recommendation that this is needed. This is a great need that's being shown by your study, but it's not known before. And so that's the kind of example that that comes to mind, but I'm sure you have many others. So again, in the discussion, you use these main points and you discuss them. You do not take the arguments again, but you take your first message or whichever message is more important. Sometimes the third one is the most interesting, and you start here. Our main finding was this. So you want to discuss first the most important. Our main finding was this, that showed a need, and therefore we propose, shows a need, you compare with literature, and therefore we propose this intervention policy for the community. And then you can discuss this one to the extent that you want. Usually the discussion is the longest part, but this is where you want to express what is it that you think should be done to address these particular issues, what you think this means, how do you interpret your data. This means there is an increase, there's a great decrease, there's increase with resistant antimicrobials with time. And we recommend, to not use broad spectrum antibiotics. Um, and then you can go and recommend more specific policies, that interventions that you think are important. So back to the tree of arguments that will guide you through the discussion, because you already analyzed the three at least arguments, that data results that you have. So first start with the main point. This is what I was saying in the first sentence, which is a power position, like we're talking how to make paragraphs. The power position is at the beginning and the end of paragraphs. Summarize only your major findings in terms of how they support your main point. So we are not going to analyze a lot of findings that are not strong. We're not going to dwell into how the controls work versus the uh, the subjects studied. We are going to summarize what the conclusion was and discuss it based on that important finding, or that one finding that we consider important to discuss. So discuss subsequent points in the orders of importance. The main point is first followed by other points in order of importance. Summarize how each point or result supports your hypothesis or conclusion. You can summarize, which you already done in results, and you did in the tree of argument, how because many times the reviewers don't agree with your discussion, and you have to have data to support what it is that you are concluding, how you interpret your data. So you can say, as seen in figure 3, we found a trend to increase of this, and you're repeating yourself a little bit, but what you put in results, but with the interpretation you want to do, this is due um, to this and these others, and it supports your same hypothesis or the same point that you had at the beginning. um, Usually, right, it could be different points that you want to discuss as well. So the implications and significance is going to be put in context of the previous research. So this is where you're going to have references to prove the previous research that it's been doing. You cannot just discuss and saying, well, it's really not known much, but you have to say very few in the literature. Something is usually published, even if it's not recent. And that could be more motivation for you to say it's important to do this, because there's not many studies on this. The only research found is so and so. And we find this is important because we've shown this is a problem. We show there is a lack, there is resistant increase, there's a lack of support. Um, and this data that you find, you said, as explained, as seen in figure 3, this is something important to the future, and then you are free to express what you think should be done, what is the next studies that should be done. There are also limitations that we should discuss, because the editors are going to find it. So our population may be not as big as we wanted to, because we didn't have the means. So we could say, yes, we only studied 50 cases, but we plan to study more with time. Or we studied 50 cases and we are going to extend it to other populations, because we think it's important to go in this direction. So you are going to propose, based on your discovery, what will improve the situation and what would be the recommendations. But don't say further studies are needed. this is a very trite sentence. So you have to have your own imagination to explain what you're saying. So this is what we're trying to say here. You have to distinguish between what you have shown versus what you imagine. So you have to say, we have shown this particular, seeds are important in, I don't know, it's the seed of your thoughts more than any literal seeds. And then what you imagine that these seeds are going to do. Discussion of interest in side issues should be limited. It detracts from the main point. Be very clear when referring to your own data versus other groups and what they have done. So this is important. When you're reading discussions, sometimes you said, this is important because it has been found this and the other, and therefore we recommend that the third to do. But it has been found is not clear if it's some references or it has been found by us. So very, very clearly when referring to your data. So it said, we found, be aggressive in this form. Gregorio was telling me we're not used to write in the first person. We did, no, it was done, because then it's actually confusing. So we found this compared to found by Carlos and Patricia, or other groups, and you cite those groups or you explain what the other groups. So you do a clear contrast of what you're referring. We found this, and Castro et al. Found that, which supports and gives strength to the findings. Or it's opposite to our findings, but we think, as you can see in table 2, our findings are strongly show this and then the other. So you don't go and refer to numbers again. You just discuss what you already presented in detail and the results. So effects observed, magnitude of the results, stronger bursts when discussing your results. As I said, we determined in this study, we demonstrated that SARC-C was necessary for antibiology in expression of whatever, and that the critical interaction between these two was found to occur in the endosomes. This is a very basic molecular study. So in this study, we demonstrated, see, that is important, or just we demonstrated that this was necessary, and the critical interaction between these two. So we're going to be clear what we found, and then compare with the others in a maybe less stronger way. In many cases, your data is not a definite answer, but the findings from the samples or the patients they were able to examine. Normally, you only have a subset of the study group if you can only suggest that your findings apply to the entire group. So sometimes limitations that you can have are displayed, and you can suggest that your findings will be applied to the entire group. So in that case, when you're suggesting something, you use weaker verbs, not as we found definite, but it could be possible. So given the extensive genetic diversity of CIV now recognized and the vast area of West Africa not yet sampled, it is quite possible that the other lineages exist and could pose risks for human infection and prove problematic for HIV diagnosis and vaccines. So this is a very good way of saying, extending your data to say, even though our sampling is small, uh, given the extensive findings that we have here, where that this quite possibly could pose a risk, and it's important for diagnostics and vaccines. So this is a very good recommendation that you can give in a smart way, not in general saying more studies are needed or this probably applies to all Africa. No, you have to be specific and think about what you want to imply. Um, how the data relates to other studies, similarities and differences with other studies that are what you, that refer to what you did. I already said that. Is your data consistent or is consistent with other studies? You contrast or you support what you found. Language expressing similarity. We found that this gene resulted in this increase of viral burden in vivo, which could also be exacerbated disease. This is consistent with previous data showing da 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 da. So you can use this. This is an example of a word you could use. When they are too similar, you say this is consistent with previous data shown. So that makes your discussion very strong. You're not just discussing your findings at, in a random way. You're discussing these findings which is consistent with others or contrast with others, with other findings. So not to be too absolute at the end of the discussion when you're making implications. Plausible explanation for this could be the other explanation is that the incidence of increase because of, but other explanations are possible. So you can explain what you found if it's very different and say this could be due to, we think this could be due to that. And we usually know, and we usually, when we're doing our work, we usually know what we want to imply because we see a trend in our results. So we say, well, how do I, how do I express this? So this is what we found, but this could be explained because of this and that and the other. And I see many of you, when you're writing your results, you want to go there and you want to say, we found increase of this because this and that on the population. You cannot say because it's your own interpretation. In the results, you say, we found this increase, we found this decrease, we found this phenomena, we found this need. And in here is where you say, it's what is needed. Or it appears that, or this data suggests, or these results may indicate that we need to do this and the other. So this is just examples of words you can use or transitions you can use. But admit your limitations if the limitation is really a limitation, and I'll show you an example. Although the specific of both primers of tuberculosis was the same sequence, also found another bacteria called Salmonella. Thus, this data had to be expressed with caution, interpreted with caution. What happened is the sequence used to do an experiment in tuberculosis also detected Salmonella. It just happened to have the same sequence, a very similar sequence. So it strongly detects tuberculosis, but as a background, you can detect Salmonella. So you add this limitation because you know your controls. And then you said, our controls, work the same. So our controls demonstrate that, yes, it detects Salmonella, but it's a clear difference with tuberculosis. This is actually from an article that happened, and the editor found that the other sequences could be detected. And so it's better if you admit it in the beginning, if you know, and discuss it right on and say, yes, this is a limitation, but it doesn't change our results. Our results are stronger than this background. So then you discuss what you're going to do next. What is your recommendations, remaining suggestions, any directions, remaining questions, remaining questions that you didn't get to answer in the limited time and funds you had, and suggestions or recommendations for the future. There are for many recommendations that I can see that the group has to continue with solving this problem. So you say further studies characterizing the distribution of the hepatitis virus in geographical region might reveal whether these family strains are emerging. So this is a very important. suggestion at the end and recommendation. Be careful, because these studies show that there is hepatitis B in this geographical area. It might reveal that this is an emerging strain, which is what we're afraid of, all of us, of all these new emerging diseases coming up in the world. So that's just some examples of how you go about the next steps and do it in a way that is pointed and thought of and not general, but specific to what you want to see done. And the last sentences, just reinforce your message and be conclusive. You can use in conclusion. Remember, people will read the beginning of the discussion and the end of the discussion. Only people that are really interested in the topic will read the whole article. So at the beginning, you start with your main message, and in conclusion, you go back to your main message, the main message, your main finding, your main new data. As part of the conclusion, we do not end with the cliche. This problem needs further studies. Be specific. Further studies or more strains of bacteria will clarify this new drug was brought antimicrobial effects or not. So further studies, specifically what you want to study, you know with your article what it is that's needed, and you will recommend that um, to the reader and to the editor. The editor would be very happy if you have nice, intelligent, specific recommendations, conclusions based on your data.
Tade was asking, does the order of our variables, I think the point here is the order of your results, matter while writing a discussion part of the manuscript? So what's the best way, the best order to present your results in the discussion?
Generally, the way in the order of importance, you have a main finding, a main discovery, a main new data that you found among all the experiments you did. You start with that. It's like the three of arguments. It's like the main conclusion we had in the first little square. Um, you start with that. You start repeating that. You say, this is our main finding. Um, we have shown this happens, and then you start comparing it with others, and then you can say, furthermore, we found these other aspects, and you can go through the different results in order to what's important to you or in the field.
I have some suggestions, comments on that too. So what I was trying to explain also for the people I've been working with, the researchers I've been working with in my workshop, during the workshop, is like I always suggest them to start, they need to think about their publications as a storyline. They're telling a story to people. So you have to make it simple to everyone. So what I usually suggest, depending on your results and type of your research, you want to start as broad as possible, and then you come to more specifics later on. For example, first of all, you started describing that there are a lot of new microcephaly, case of microcephaly in Brazil, and we are trying to identify the source of the case. As you go in your results, you end up by discovering that this microcephaly case were being caused by Zika virus infection. But then you start from the broad, bigger picture to come to the more specific one. So you tell people a storyline. So that's the way I would suggest to order your results and then later your discussion. The discussion is basically almost repeating your results, but putting that in context with the literature. So just tell a storyline, whatever is easier to explain your results to people, how they can understand. It started with the broad, it started with your genetic profiling, and then all of a sudden you discover this important gene, and this gene you start focusing more on it, and then later you discover the function of that specific gene. So you go big to the small. So that's easier for people to understand. That's my advice.
Yeah, very nice advice. And then when you get to the small of your discovery, that's where you're going to start discussing what is the importance of it that took you to your new finding. Thank you.
Thank you. Next question is from Sieda. When mentioning data is similar or different to previous studies, Should we mention the previous studies in references? And how many previous studies are necessary to make such comment?
You mentioned the previous studies and references. All previous studies have to be documented. But don't bog yourself down with too many references and too many comparisons. I have seen discussions where they talk about different countries and different cases in each country, and it's way too much. They found this in Brazil, but it's not the same as found in Paraguay. It's not the same to found in Africa. It's not the same found in North America, and then it's a lot of references contrasting all these other findings that are not to the point, and the reader will just get tired and confused. So make it easy to read, like Gregorio just said. It's a story you're telling. um, Try to explain it in a simple way, but do not get too much involved in one point and make it too long and to compare with too many data. It's better to take the main data that is similar to you, or the data that contrasts you, and compare with that, always with references.
Thank you. Next question is from Mayara. Can we write results and discussion together?
Sometimes there are journals that are allowed to write results and discussion, if that's what she means or he means. It is very tempting and it is really nice, although it makes the result discussion section very long, that if you could present your research and discuss it, but you have to do it in a very orderly way with subheadings, which will guide the reader. But it depends on the journal. Very few journals allow this, but there are few that do. So you cannot do this if the journal is not accepting this style. You have to go to that journal that you want to use to publish and find out if you can do this results discussion in one section. The other thing you can do is write in parallel, if that's what you're asking. So if you're writing a result and you think of the things that you would like to discuss, which is your own opinion, write it and make an outline of the discussion. With each point that you want to what you want to say for each point that it comes to you to mind. So you will have a draft of the discussion that you have to go back to later.
Thank you. Next question is from Hisham. He asks, sometimes there are no similar studies to compare with in discussion. What should we do?
Well, you say exactly that. We could not find any description of this in the literature. And this shows that the need to do this study. There is not known data on this particular aspect, provided that you did really do an extensive literature search in any place in the world or any place. It could be that you can compare it with other countries if there is a publication. It depends on the case or not. But you could say we were not able to find any previous work on this subject. Therefore, the need to shed knowledge onto it and do more studies.
Thank you. We have a few minutes until the break, so I'm going to go back to some of the previous topics.
Okay.
Okay.
Yes.
So, for example, there are some very interesting questions here. For example, Bayu is asking, in very few cases, only the methodology is published. I think he's referring to methods papers. So what is the advantage of doing that?
If you found a new method that works better, you can just describe the methodology paper. They're not very usual. It has to be something that really has something new, or a new model you're proposing based on other studies. You always have to base it on something. You cannot just come out there and say, oh, I found this new methodology and it's fantastic. You say, there is no a good method to study these, and we decided to try to find or found a better method, and I want to tell you about it. The problem with that is that you should be testing the new method and showing some of the results. So it depends how theoretical it is. Sometimes there are ways of teaching better, ways of helping the community better based on experience. You want to come up with a new model of teaching. Those are reasonable to describe.
Yeah, I have an experience, an example for during my PhD time. What I've seen, I was trying to work on a method that I had never worked before, and then I realized that there's a group that developed the method. So what they did, they had a very unique technique that could be applied to many fields of science, in cancer, immunology, etc. So that's very broad. A lot of people could use it, and they had already a lot of publications with that method. They were not thoroughly describing the method because the method was very complicated to do, but they already had used the method very successfully in several research. And at one point later, they decided to write just one methods paper so they could explain every single step in detail, which reagents to use, where to buy. So that was very useful. It was a method that came after they have proved the value of their method, of their protocol. And then later they just wanted to share the protocol in detail. And that's the protocol that I was using to try to adapt because it was very clearly laid out. So that was very useful. So that's one way of doing this. You publish your protocol whenever you think this is very applicable to many other fields and people are really interested in understanding the details instead of having people send you email all the time, ask you, how did you do this? How much did you add of that? No, you just write a protocol so everybody can go to your protocol and read it.
Fantastic. Very good.
Thank you. Yeah, I think that I can give an example of that. A friend of mine, he was working on mass spectrometry, and so far you could only do mass spectrometry in purified proteins. And they found a method on how to do that in proteins that were in membranes. So there is an impact of that in so many fields. So he published a methods paper in Nature describing that method. So it's clearly something that can be used in so many fields. So I think this is the main point.
Fantastic.
Muted myself, sorry. So there is another very interesting question, which is from Sahiti. So they're asking, can we really split one research into different manuscripts? Is it ethical?
Not ethical if one of them is published. So same results in different manuscripts, is that what he said?
I think, so he asks one research into different manuscripts. So I think that this question came when we were mentioning, for example, if you've done the same method and you're publishing again about that. So I think maybe he or she was confused about, you know.
Yes, it helps. The first time you describe it at length, and the second time you're going to publish the same research, the same methodology, you quote yourself. You said this was previously published and give the reference. If you're doing two papers at the same time and you're putting the same methodology, same data, you have to wait until one is published. You cannot publish the same data in two different journals in case you have to go one by one. One is accepted to meet the other with different data, or just publish in once.
What you can do is, again, as you mentioned, if your first paper you publish your method, and then the second one you cite it, you can of course use the same method if you are addressing different questions as well, right? So each paper you are addressing different questions. In one, you're going to talk about X and this population, genetic population in South America, and you have another paper that you have a different find, you have a different question, research question in a different group somewhere else, or you are just using some information from the previous paper as a support for your next paper. But the most important thing is the papers, even though they are using similar methods, which is fine, you are addressing different research questions. It's not the same type of publication, if I understood well your question.
Yeah, we called it salami science here in Brazil. So you're not supposed to do salami science, which is taking a piece of research and slicing it into several papers. Each paper has to tell a story, but obviously you can have from your PhD several papers addressing different questions and different stories. Okay, so let me. There is one question here about the tree of arguments. So from what I learned from the last few sessions, I understood that we need to prepare a tree for each section of the manuscript separately. Please comment. So I think the question is, he or she understood that for each section of the manuscript, you need a different tree. So is that the case?
No. For each section of the manuscript, you use different parts of the tree. So maybe I misspoke. So you use those 3 arguments in the one tree for each section of the results of the same, with the same goal and the same main point that you discover. Is that answered? Yeah.
I think so. If it doesn't, please ask another question. We have some questions here about the conclusion. How long the conclusion should be? How many lines are standard?
Oh, I couldn't say. It depends. Not very long. I would say in conclusion, it should be 1 paragraph, but you can have in conclusion and recommendations, which is very much at the end, or you can have recommendations, several recommendations, and at the end, in conclusion, you can make a 1 general conclusion of the need of this. It shouldn't be too long. A few sentences just to summarize everything. There is not a standard number of how many words you should have, how many conclusions. Don't make it. Tell a story in a nice way, like Gregorio was saying. I like that idea. You're telling the story to somebody, and you're explaining at the end the need and the recommendations, but don't go on and on and on. Just do it in an orderly, clear way, 1 by 1, and then in conclusion. But there is not a set limit of how long or short it should be. The discussion is usually the longest section because of all the opinions you're going to have. But do not make it confusing. Tell the story, read it again, and make sure you're linking one to the other and it's making a nice story to tell for the reader.
On that note, Benedict is asking, what should the conclusion be about? The results or the discussion?
Or the discussion?
What should the conclusion be about? The discussion or the results?
Oh, the results. Okay, so it should be based on the results, but you discuss the results, so it's all about the results. So I see what he means. You've been discussing this and these different aspects of the result, and at the end you say, in conclusion, you go back to your data, or you go back to the. No, it could be about the discussion. You can conclude. Depends on the topic. You can conclude that there is a great need for this to have more support in the community, and then you are basing the conclusion on what you discuss and you show the need. Or you can make the conclusion, in conclusion, we showed this particular new finding, which I think is important for future research in this particular way. Or in conclusion, we showed the need of more studies in this area that is not well known. And then, we show this, but more is needed. So it depends on your data and how you want to conclude a discussion that you've been leading on a particular new model or new method, then you're based more on the discussion. But if it's just hard data, you end with your data, with your finding. In conclusion, we found this and more is needed. And then you discuss.
Thank you. Question from Mitila. Is it worth to include the strengths and limitations of the study into the discussion. Should I include it as a separate heading before the conclusion, or should it be in the middle? Yeah, limitations and strengths of your research.
Well, the strength you're going to advertise in several times. You're going to discuss the strength. The limitations you only mention once, where it's appropriate. What kind of limitation when you're discussing that particular argument. You don't advertise the limitations. You don't write a lot of limitations, just those that are obviously confusing for the reader or honestly problems with the data or the experimentation or the population study, the limitation of not being able to study more. And then you go back to your strengths. But this, so you say there's a limitation we found. We didn't have enough data. We didn't have enough population. But we think this is enough to show the trend. And you go back to your strength. So you advertise more your strength and you convince the reader this is important and relevant despite this limitation.
Thank you. We have a question from Eshetu. The question is, to what extent data from the results sections should be used in the discussion? So I guess this is something about, making sure your discussion isn't just a repetition of your results. So how can you what's the appropriate amount of repetition of results and other things that should be in your discussion?
You repeat the results, but not the data of the results. You repeat the main conclusion of each result, but you don't bring back the numbers and tables and figures that you present. You don't bog down the discussion with numbers. You say, we found a trend of, our main finding is that the antibiotic resistance is increased. We studied over 3 years, and this is showing a trend in this particular, like penicillin, amoxicillin is going up. And then you start your discussion. So you're not going to bring and say, as seen in table 1, there is 30% in 1 year and then 80% in another year showing the increase. You're not going to repeat the numbers in the discussion. You're just going to say, we saw a trend and of increase up to 80%. So you could use some data to make the point strong, up to 80% of increase of resistance, which then you do compare with other places, which other hospitals or countries or regions have found resistance. And then at the end, if you have other articles that have shown how to curb the resistance to antibiotic, you can recommend. In this particular case, they took these measures that were of a result, were of an advantage, and we will strongly make recommendations to the hospital or whatever. I'm making all this up, but this is a way of discussing something. You refer to your data, only the strong findings without repeating the results, and then you discuss that and put it on the context of other findings. Thanks.
Thank you. I think there is someone who wants to, Simone, you want to say something, and then we can close the session and go to our break.
Thank you. Actually, few minutes back, I asked a question about that developing multiple manuscripts from a single data. So I guess I had confused everyone. I'm an anthropologist, and when I was collecting data, it was a population survey. So at a single point of time, from n number of women, I collected data on multiple issues like reproductive healthcare, and then pluralistic healthcare behavior and care during pregnancy. All this data I cannot put into a single manuscript. So I wanted to develop 3 separate manuscripts but using the data that had collected at a single point of time. So is this a tsunami prediction?
So let me just check
And
if
how
I
the
got your question right. So you've collected a big amount of data,
Yes.
and you are going to, but it's too much to analyze in only one paper. So you're writing 3 separate papers,
Yes.
and you want to know if that's all right.
Yes.
Yes.
Okay.
And how the methodology, in that case, should I mention the original thesis as a reference, or I should say the published manuscript as a reference? Like you had told me, I need to refer my earlier papers for the methodology section. So should I refer my thesis or the paper already published?
Right. So the second question is specifically about the methodology on that.
Yes.
So how do you do that? If you're going to publish 3 different papers, they are all about the same data set that you collected. What are you going to do about the methodology?
If you're using the same methodology, you explain the same methodology. In the case that one article is published ahead of the others, you can just go, if you haven't submitted yet, the second or third article, you can say the methodology was used as described and you cite yourself. But if you're writing 3 articles and you're going to send them the 3 to publication at the same time with different data, you have to explain them, use the same methodology in each. It's the same methodology, but it has to be described because it hasn't been published yet. And as Gregorio advised, it's better to change the wording a little bit so it doesn't look like you copy everything, but it's very much the same. You said we use the methodology this way, and just change a few words in an easy way, and you explain the methodology for the 3 articles. As I say, unless you publish one first, then you're free to reference yourself.
I also advise that if you have 3 publications that you think they are very much connected, I think it's better if you publish one, in my opinion, it's better if you publish one paper instead of 3, because then you're going to strengthen your paper. You're going to have more arguments and more novelty in one single place than having 3 papers. In many cases, quantity is not a factor, is not necessarily a good factor, but the quality of your research. So if you have a stronger paper, I would rather have one stronger one than a 3 smaller ones, because people will be more likely to read your paper at one place than split in 3 parts, if the subjects are relatable and they can help each other.
Actually, they are quite separate. Like pregnancy care, I was studying in the tribal population, how they are caring during pregnancy. So they are using anti-modern methods or their dietary pattern, what were their working pattern, all those things are there. But in the pluralistic medical health, what type of medical health they are taking during pregnancy? It's traditional healer or modern medicine. So I was comparing there for which symptoms they are going for traditional healer and for which symptom they are going for seeking modern healthcare facility. So these 2 things, dietary pattern and health seeking behavior, are quite different. So putting both this into a single paper.
As we mentioned before, it really depends which story you're telling. If there is no connection, no connection between them, then you have 3 papers, 2 or 3 papers. And if you have enough data and evidence for each of the papers, right, then you have 3 papers. But if they are similar, if they are the same storyline, can you tell a story, then it's 1 paper. I think that's more how you have to analyze it.